All right, welcome to episode 80 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Ashley Bohrer. She's the new APA public philosophy editor. She's an academic, activist, and public intellectual. She's assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame and previously held a postdoctoral position at Hamilton College. Her research in the fields of philosophy, critical race studies, decolonial theory, intersectional feminism, and Marxism explores the intersections of capitalism, colonialism, racism, and heterosexism. Welcome, Ashley.
Thanks.
And so obviously your resume is incredibly impressive. So just to be a little bit vague here, but I think we want to touch as much of this as possible. My first question is going to be, can you tell us a little bit about your academic background and in particular your recent book?
Yeah. So I have a PhD in philosophy and really studied a lot of what's called continental philosophy, coming out of the French and German traditions primarily. And during the course of my doctoral work, I started getting really interested in feminism and critical race studies, and also in Latin American philosophy, particularly Latin American political philosophy. And I've always been really interested in questions about politics and like the relationship between structures of domination and how we fight them. So most of my work centers on trying to untangle some of the various questions about that relationship. So my book, Marxism and Intersectionality, which you all, readers can get at Columbia University Press if they like, is really about thinking through the relationship between what I find to be two of the most compelling theories about how to understand how messed up the world is. And that's Marxism on the one hand and intersectionality on the other. And really what the book looks at is how both in the academic realm and in the activist realm, there's a lot of animosity between these two camps maybe, or traditions as I like to call them. But really, I think a lot of that animosity is misplaced, and that there are ways to bring these two ways of thinking about changing the world closer together, and that I think we would be better off if we did that.
Yeah. Oh, what's intersectionalism? I actually don't know. Marxism, I'm aware of, but
good question.
Yeah, good question. So there's a whole chapter in the book about this that goes through what it means exactly to do intersectionality. But if I were to break it down really into its core commitment, I would say that intersectionality is about seeing the ways that many axes of identity or domination, so things like racism, sexism, heteropatriarchy, ableism, are not separate from one another, but are actually totally intermeshed and intertwined. And so part of what intersectionality is trying to do is to get us to not think you can just solve racism as a problem totally on its own without thinking about gender or sexuality or class. Actually, in order to solve all these problems fully, you need to solve them together.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, but it's not, but just from my understanding, you're not saying kind of like what we a lot of times hear from, let's say, Dem socialists when they're saying if we solve the class problem, automatically we're kind of negating or eliminating the racial issues and the sexist issues. What you're just saying is that, no, all of these issues together are just equally important and they need to be solved separately. It's not saying that if we solve one, then automatically the others are done.
Exactly. So this is one of the big arguments between a certain kind of Marxist, not all Marxists, hashtag not all Marxists believe this, but some Marxists, right, have this argument that if you solve the problem of capitalism, if you overcome, class antagonism, then magically, right, racism and sexism will melt away. And intersectionality is really one of the ways that I think it helpfully pushes Marxism is to really doubt that's real. There's actually a great film that came out in the 80s called Born in Flames that is specifically about this. It's a kind of sci-fi film that focuses on queer Black women that looks at the communist revolution has happened, and yet racism and sexism have not magically melted away.
Right.
And I think really, as a theory, intersectionality is trying to respond to, why we shouldn't expect for racism and sexism to just like magically float away when we
Right. Yeah, and then I mean, so not to get into this, I guess, too much, because I mean that's not really the point. But so we're both Russian, and so I was born in the USSR, and so a lot of times when people talk about like kind of what communist ideology is, right? The idea is, well, like kind of Russia was sort of this brotherhood, right? And in some sense that was true, but it's only because it was full of a lot of white folks. So unfortunately, and look, I hate to bring this up, but it's also true, and I think it's worth noting and discussing. A lot of Russian people are racist. It is what it is. I mean, that's just what I've seen in our communities, and that's just how it is, right? And so, I mean, obviously they don't like, for us to bring it up, but again, these are the facts of reality. And so the notion there is that, well, if we somehow challenge the class system, then all of a sudden racism isn't going to exist. That never really made any sense to me, because if we're thinking about racism and we're thinking about it as an issue, you can easily have a brotherhood of people who are just white dudes, right? And you kind of see that in the founding fathers and American ideology. I mean, it was just a bunch of white dudes who said we were created equal, but like here are all of these other people who don't count there. So is that something that when you focus on that idea in your book, I guess the question there is, how did sort of Marx understand that then? How did Marx understand the difference between sort of classist divides and then racism and sexism? If he sort of spoke about it, and how did he kind of see the connections between all of them?
Yeah, he did. He actually wrote quite extensively about, I wouldn't say he wrote about race or gender, because those are pretty big concepts, but he certainly wrote specifically about the differential relationship of Black people to capitalism, of women to capitalism, of the way that slavery was a system of exploitation, of the way that the colonization of the Americas was, specifically invented in order to propel forward capitalist accumulation. He wrote a lot about the specific exploitation of not only women, but also children inside industrial capitalism. And so Marx was quite attentive to the way that that exploitation is set up in a variety of ways that is differentiated along not just class lines, but also like intra-class divisions, gender, race, age. And he also was very committed to the idea that liberation was not possible for anyone without the liberation of all people. So he's very, very famously said, like labor in white skin cannot be free as long as labor in Black skin is branded, right? So you can't have a liberated white working class as long as there is still racialized slavery. So Marx was attentive to this. I think what he said, while good and puts us on the right path, is like not quite enough to deal with the complexity of the relationship between race, gender, sexuality, ability, and capitalism. But certainly he talked about it. Certainly he wrote about it. There are some really good books that I can recommend about Marx's like own thinking about some of these questions.
I was just wondering, this is probably a really dumb question, but it has to be asked. Why do you think Marx has such a bad rep? For example, when if somebody utters Marxism, let's say in the news media, it just, I don't know, images rush you just think of communism, you think bad, you can't,
Gulag, Gulag, Stalin.
Gulag,
right.
Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn, but yeah, so these things sort of just come to mind, but why do you think that is, and maybe what could we maybe do to sort of look at Marxism the right way, even though you have highlighted the things that he wrote about, which were the good things?
I mean, I think there are sort of two reasons why this happens, and they're kind of connected. The first reason is that I think a lot of terrible things have happened under the name of communism or under the name of socialism. Anyone who like works with Marx's texts or who is really committed to reading in the Marxist tradition knows that gulags have nothing to do with communism or socialism in the way that Marx envisioned them, and the way that communists envision them now. But certainly like the fact that people who called themselves communists and thought about their own projects using that term then kind of sours the taste maybe of Marxism, communism, socialism in the minds of people who rightly are scared of certain kinds of atrocities. But related to that is also that the people who control the media, right, the ruling class, the people who write our textbooks, the people who own, news media, are precisely the kinds of people who have everything to lose by democratizing our economy, right? Like the super, super wealthy, the top, not just like the top 1%, but the top 1% of the top 1% of the top 1%, right? Are the people who have the most to gain from demonizing the idea that society should be organized to meet human needs rather than to create profit.
Yeah.
So like when you have people who are in control of the instruments of the dissemination of ideas, who have a lot to lose from the idea of Marxism or communism, they're certainly going to push the idea that it's some like bad, scary, as Marx once called, the specter haunting Europe or specter haunting, right, America. There's a reason why they do that in their interest.
And it also kind of seems like what they're saying, like, let's say these kind of ultra rich, these billionaire types, what they're saying is that when they're saying that Marxism is anti-freedom, what they might be saying is it's anti-our freedom. Like, we don't want limits placed on us, right? We want to sort of manage the media in the way that we have been. We want to be able to make as much money without really considering other people as we have been. And so
totally.
I wonder, yeah, how did that sort of, from your understanding, how did that connection happen where sort of in the American mind, Marxism became anti-freedom, where if you're a communist or if you have like, let's say any, let's say, kind of dem socialist beliefs, or even, I don't know, you want a stronger safety net here. How did that become associated with, oh, we want to give these people a little bit more money with, oh my God, that means I have no freedom and I'm going to be sort of rushed to the gulag too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a super long history, and in a certain sense, like some of that goes all the way back to the first like colonizing settlers that came to North America. But this like really, I think, really swings or like ramps up in the 20th century, especially after World War I and the Russian Revolution, and even then more after World War II, when like the first and second Red Scares happen, where the United States becomes sort of hysterically paranoid about the idea, oh my goodness, that the underclass could maybe, I don't know, have rights and maybe be entitled to things, crazy things, crazy things, like an 8-hour working day and maybe some breaks and maybe child labor protections. Holy goodness, right? Like, and this really starts the idea that people should be able to organize with their fellow workers in order to demand things like lunch breaks and higher wages really sent, the ruling class into a dizzying tailspin, like a frenzy of anxiety about the real power that working people have if they band together in order to better their condition and take control of a society that should be for them. And then this gets like more and more intense over the course of the 20th century and the Cold War, and then the rise of neoliberalism. So like, I think that, there's a really long, super interesting story to be told about how communism became this intense demon in the United States. But ultimately, I think this was always going to be true. Like communism and socialism, in a certain sense, have to be vilified by the capitalist class in order to maintain its dominance. Because who in their right mind, right, would say like, oh no, I opt into this system of being exploited by richer people than me. And I want to die in the street without health insurance or labor protections or anything else. Like it's silly. So you have to like back up the system on the one hand with a threat of incredible violence, and on the other hand with a narrative mechanism, right? What Marxists will call ideology, a story, a really compelling story that is stuffed down your throat from the time you're really small, in order to make the system seem not only that it's fine, but that it's the only system possible, right? Or the only system that can guarantee freedom or something like this, which is obviously crazy.
Mm. Yeah, and something that Alan and I like talk about on the show frequently, how we talk about like tribalism and sort of like how people get into political ideologies.
That and the dissemination of knowledge, that very technically speaking, it serves the ruling class for us to have these different echo chambers and that were segmented in different groups of thought. And, totally. Especially nowadays with people having alternate realities of the news, at times, not everybody does, but of course, then you have people then participating in tribalism, right? They'll think, no, my information is correct, your information is wrong, I'm right, you're wrong. all of this. A lot of people won't necessarily, unless you're operating from a higher level order of thinking, you're then going to try to integrate all the information that you get. But most people don't do that. And it's crazy how that serves the ruling class to keep them in power. Like nobody wants to let go of their power. So if this system works for them, they're going to, as chaotic as it is, let it do what it does. But sorry, what were you going to say?
No, yeah. So, and then what I was thinking was just a question to Ashley. So how do you think in terms of, so do you feel like they've sort of co-opted the idea of like, kind of, I guess the American dream and sort of just patriotism in general to say, okay, here's our team, right? Everybody who lives here is on our team and we all kind of take care of each other, maybe kind of like when we're talking about supply side economics, right? But then here are these other sort of foreigners, right? And they're talking about something else, right? So they're sort of feeding you this kind of perception of this ideology that's actually toxic, right? It's sort of like a Trojan horse. But we are the ones who are protecting you because we're Americans just like you. And so we want you to be free, right? Just like we're free. So we don't want you to impose on our freedom, and we're not going to impose on your freedom, right? Those people want to take your freedoms away. So do you feel like kind of that image of the American kind of, in this case, I guess, man, but also the American human, right? That's the thing that sort of helps propel them to, propels their narrative in a sense. That helps kind of people, it helps people kind of latch onto it and say, okay, like these people are a part of our team, right? Even though obviously, how many of us have ever even known millionaires, let alone billionaires?
Sure. Yeah. And I think a really central part of the American dream is the so-called, right? Is that like, if you work hard enough, you're going to succeed. Right. And so it's a totally individualistic narrative that like the only thing that is responsible for your success or failure is how hard you work or not. And if you are in poverty, or if you don't have health insurance, or if you're ill or whatever, that must be your own fault, right? You didn't bootstrap hard enough. And really, like what this narrative of the American dream does is it allows for the system to say, any one of you who aren't millionaires or billionaires, that's your own damn fault. And I'm totally deserving of my ostentatious wealth. It has nothing to do with the fact that, for example, if I'm the Walton family that owns Walmart, has nothing to do with the fact that a majority of my employees are on food stamps. And that meaning that the American government subsidizes my ability to pay my workers poverty wages, right? Which is actually the real story of how capitalism works, through tax breaks, through super low minimum wages, through loopholes, through all of these things, is that the mass of working people in the United States are subsidizing millionaires and billionaires, not the other way around. The other thing to say about the narrative of the American dream is that, like, well, on the one hand, I want to critique it for the way that it is like, super individualistic. On the other hand, it also produces this kind of fake collective, right? We're Americans, that has always been set up over and against Indigenous people in this country and countries and people from around the world. And so in another sense, like the other way that the American dream works is in a hyper-racist projection of who Americans are and what they should look like and who they should be. And that then allows us to justify exploitation, domination, violence, and military action against anyone who's not American. So on the one hand, it like works in order to justify our poverty, and on the other hand, works in order to justify like massive atrocities against non-white people and non-Americans at one and the same time. Does double duty. And it turns out that the same people, right, who are making money from underpaying Walmart workers are the same people who are making bank on defense contracts and munitions and all of those kinds of things, right? Same class of people.
Yeah. And okay. And, interesting. I'm curious. So we had David Livingston Smith on whenever it was, I think about like 5-6 months ago, something like that. Who obviously, he's a member of the APA. So we talked about so he and Kate Mann have a disagreement on whether or not they believe dehumanization is real. And I want to know, what do you think? Do you think that people do actually dehumanize others, or do you think that there's some other mechanism going on?
I'm always really I always want to know what people mean by dehumanization. Like if we mean something, do people use narratives and tropes in order to treat people as less than human? Like the answer is obviously yes, right? Like totally, people do this all the time. I don't think that's really, a debatable question. On the other hand, I'm also often worried about the human exceptionalism that's built into worries about dehumanization. Because if we weren't so interested in devaluing non-human life, like the planet we live on, then dehumanization, I think, would be much less of a, like, we'd be less interested or less freaking out about dehumanization if we were actively valuing other parts of the world as well.
Yeah. And if you
Yeah.
sort of think about it, just the concept of dehumanization, it's kind of interesting that we actually can do this to any kind of life form, even though I'm not, look, I'm not exempt from this. I do this all the time too. I mean, it's sort of a shitty part of my own sort of psyche and being. But to me, it's kind of interesting that not only, okay, so we're saying that, let's say dehumanization is wrong. Most people would agree on that. But then we kind of like devalue like insects, we devalue like maybe other types of animals. That's so interesting that we kind of do that, because if you think about it, I mean, life in general is life. I mean, how do you really even differentiate between which life is worth it and which isn't? And then once you start differentiating, like, how do you not just build up and say, well, I mean, maybe even these people aren't worth it? Like, who's to really say? Feels
Totally.
arbitrary.
I mean, the idea of like what constitutes a human, also just like in philosophy, but also like in Western culture, has always been a deep racist projection, right? There's like never been a point in American or Western culture that really embraced the idea that anyone, like that any being of this species is really fully, truly human in the same way as all others, right? Those like all men are created equal stuff. Actually, when you look down, like when you investigate what practices have been socially associated with humanization, this was always a racial and gender differentiated category, meaning like what is often baked into or assumed to be part of this concept of human or humanity has a really worrying history, right? That's like really steeped in racist and sexist beliefs.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and just going back to another guest about Brian Van Norden, this reminds me of that episode. And even Dag Herbiansrud, right? We talk about kind of like how sort of philosophy has been whitewashed. And so, I mean, this is actually a good segue to this question. So do you feel like in terms of being a public philosophy editor, right, which you obviously are at the APA blog, do you feel like one of sort of your goals is to kind of help, let's see what the word is, to sort of help people understand how philosophy was whitewashed, and in particular how for, I guess, centuries at this point, it was sort of used as a field, not only to necessarily just maintain power or to maintain power for that particular class of people, but it was also used as a field to kind of to sort of negate and kind of silence people who probably would have been as great and were even as great of philosophers as these other people who kind of ran academia.
Totally. I mean, so like on the one hand, I think something that really interests me about public philosophy is finding philosophy or like elevating or having people see and recognize that philosophy is happening outside of spaces that institutional philosophy designates to be like true philosophy.
Right.
Because that's always been happening, right? And like philosophers have always said, oh no, the real philosophy is a bunch of us like educated rich white men reading other dead educated rich white men, and that's the only thing that philosophy can ever be. And obviously people have been doing philosophy, asking like interesting questions and coming up with interesting theories outside of that really small context for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so I'm quite interested in the way that public philosophy looks outside of the academy, looks outside of this like super white, dead white man canon in order to find philosophical insight. And I'm also interested in pieces and discussions of the history of the canonization of philosophy and like why philosophy took, disciplinary institutional philosophy took that route, right? So I think that's also, I'll say just as someone with a PhD in philosophy, a really understudied part of the discipline's own history. So you can get a PhD in philosophy in the United States and never take a class, for example, on feminism, on philosophy of race, on any non-white or non-European scholar, without any consideration of the history of the discipline as discipline. You can take classes on John Locke and never know at the PhD level. You could take 0 classes on John Locke and not know that he wrote the Constitution for the state of South Carolina, that allowed slave masters, quote, absolute dominion, including the life of right and death, over their human enslaved property, right?
Wow.
So like, I think philosophy really has a lot of reckoning to do, not just with its own insularity, but also like the history of the fuller history and the fuller context of what the people who are already inside that insular canon, like what else they have done and what they have contributed to. I think there's a real reckoning that philosophy is quite late to. I think a lot of other disciplines in academic thought have reckoned with this or like come face to face with it a bit sooner than philosophy does. And I think the idea, there's still this like really entrenched idea that what you do as a philosopher is like abstract from the world. You're like this disembodied brain in a vat that is making cool thoughts, right? That actually your body is a distraction, thanks Descartes, right? And I think that is really held back the reckoning with a lot of these questions. So absolutely, part of what I'm trying to do with the APA, part of what I try to do when I set up my classes with my undergrads, with my graduate students, is really to approach philosophy in this more holistic way with a wider vision that critically evaluates the canon as we have it and also looks outside of it for other avenues and other ways of doing philosophy. Sure.
Yeah. I love that, and I feel like that's pretty just so similar. But well, your sort of understanding of public philosophy is very similar to what we do too, and obviously to what a lot of our guests do as well. A lot of what we talked about is so a lot of what we talk about just in general is practical. So we talk about sort of practical tools and practical ideas. It's not so important for us to find general truths because I honestly I don't even know how to do that. Right? I'm not that smart. So our thinking is essentially like, how do we kind of help people kind of use these ideas to essentially lead like healthier and better lives? And, how do they find sort of some joy or some semblance of it in the world?
Yeah, there's that. And even if we're not the ones to disseminate that knowledge, we'll have, someone like you come on who's actually an expert, and be able to relate this to people as well. It doesn't have to stay in these spaces, right? Or these institutionalized spaces, for the elite, right?
Yeah. And it's funny. I remember once a friend of mine and we went to this I think it was a public lecture. We went to this public lecture in NYU, and it was about something. I think it was about like perception of color or something like that. And so what it was these three philosophers. So I don't remember their names, but they were brilliant in the field and sort of highly regarded. And I think we stayed for the for the lecture for about, I think it was 10 to 15 minutes, and then we couldn't sit through it anymore.
Why?
So it was so useless, man. So first of all, not only did they not actually speak, so what they did was one person read from one research paper, then the next person read their own response from their own research paper, and then the third person contradicted the first two people. So we just were like, wait, we don't understand. Like, how is this useful? I think it's great. Look, the work is brilliant. Let me just say that the work that they were doing was just highly intellectual, even beyond me. I was like, I don't understand what they're even talking about. But the question there was, okay, so it's great that you guys are this smart, and it's wonderful that you can even open this up to the public, and we could talk about perception, what that looks like based on neuroscience, and what the brain imaging scans show. That's great. But we were thinking, how does this help people? Like in terms of the sort of kind of proverbial how to live a good life, notion. How does this help people? Like, what does somebody take away from this and go out into the world saying, okay, you know what? I am like much better for having gone to this lecture than I was obviously if I had not, or even before.
Well, let me just be devil's advocate for a second. Were they saying that neurologically speaking, that people of different color are similar, genetically similar?
No, they were just saying that essentially the argument from my vague memory of it was that all of us view color differently in the brain. And so it's like one person may view color like with a tiny difference of a shade, and then the other person will view it with another sort of shade, which is cool. I mean, it's nice, like it's fun information. But I guess my question in all of this is like, to what end, right? So what is philosophy for? And then Ashley, going into your activism, right? I guess, when did you discover that philosophy was supposed to have a purpose? Like, when was it that you figured out that, okay, if I'm going to do this, let's say, I'm going to devote X amount of years of my life to this doctorate, that this has to be for something, that I need to do something with it to help better the world?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was kind of a process. I decided to go get a PhD in philosophy after taking a really impactful course on the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. And really in particular, I was reading in that class Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment. and they have a really, really beautiful essay chapter. It's like kind of a wild text. It doesn't really feel finished, but like on the culture industry. And it was a really deep reflection on how culture is produced in line with power, right? And how like power is responsible for so much of the culture that we receive, obviously not on the internet because this was written a long time ago, but, television, music, movies, again, this was also before television, but, like all of the ways that we receive culture are not just like pure works of artistic prowess. They're deeply embedded in trying to produce and reinforce a narrative about the world. And that's that some people deserve poverty and others deserve luxury. And that really impacted, I had never really thought that there was a, reason or a logic or, like ulterior motives behind, like whatever weird television show I was watching on a Tuesday night. And that really like sort of shook my world. And I was like, okay, well, I should like investigate this a bit more, not really necessarily knowing if I wanted to be a professional philosopher, whatever that meant, though it did seem at the time quite romantic. I promise it is much less romantic than it sounds. Like you think, like at the time, I was like 19 and I was like, oh, it must just be like, you read books all day and have like, amazing, impressive, like world-changing thoughts. And I promise anyone who is listening, that is like not what my life is like at all. That's like not what our lives are like.
Yeah.
It's mostly a lot of emails. But,
yeah.
a lot of emails, really, really, really little amount of thinking, really big, deep thoughts. And so like, I went into my PhD really thinking that I was going to study aesthetics, philosophy of art and architecture in particular. And then when I was in graduate school, really early on, Occupy Wall Street happened. And I was in Chicago at the time. That's right. I was getting my PhD. And I was really like shifted and changed by being a part of the Occupy movement. I'd always done political stuff, but I had done it more in the context of like formally established nonprofit institutions with like federal tax ID numbers and like large donors, and in this very like professionalized setting. I went to undergrad in DC. I interned at a lot of big political nonprofits. And this really was the first time that I thought that I saw and experienced politics happening in a different way. That was like about how we can instantiate the future we want now. Right? It's sometimes called prefigurative politics. And really that like, it's a little cliche to say, I think, especially for people of my generation who were involved with Occupy, but like it really changed the course of my life. And I started really thinking about and reflecting on philosophical questions in light of what I was learning in the streets at Occupy, like what kinds of questions were becoming really important, how we were reckoning with confronting power, but also confronting the ways that living in a capitalist, racist, patriarchal, ableist society had, even despite my own good intentions, like left its imprint on me. And how do you reckon with that at the same time that you reckon with like the structures out there in the world? Like, how do you change the world and change yourself at the same time? And really like from there, all of my interest in philosophy really changed and got reoriented toward trying to address those questions.
And in that firsthand experience with reckoning with power, is it that you all sort of learned how to deal with, I mean, this is a little too obvious, I'm sure you mean other ways as well, but in, let's say, dealing with police, let's say, for, you have a mass gathering of people and you kind of see how you could sort of combine, protest and getting the message out, but without necessarily being too much of how do I put this? Like, I don't know, without getting them to do anything to you. I don't know how to verbalize that.
I will say you don't have to provoke cops to beat the crap out of you. I can say from firsthand experience, they beat the crap out of you anytime they think they can get away with it. I've been beaten in the face with police batons. I've been thrown on the ground. I've had clothes torn off my body by uniformed agents of the state. Like, I just like want to make, especially in the context of this summer's protests, like the idea that it is protesters who provoke police into violent response is debunk. That is one of the narratives that like corporate media wants people to believe. Like, and all you have to do in order to see that is to like look who shows up to a protest with weapons. It is always the cops. The cops are the ones who show up looking for a riot. The cops are the ones who show up to create a riot. The cops are the one that beat the crap out of us every single time. So like, I'm always really like, I'm always quite sharp and critical of this, you know, sort of exhortation, like just protest peacefully, just protest peacefully. You know how many times I've been sitting in the street singing a song, protesting peacefully, to then get like physically beaten up by huge people in body armor with sound cannons, tear gas grenades, batons, and guns? A lot. Like this is what, and the thing about it is like, this is what police are intended to do. They're intended to protect private property, and they are intended in order to break resistance. This is their whole job.
And it's important to know, right? I mean, I definitely what you just, I had no clue. I mean, I had some idea that things are happening that obviously are not being reported on the news, but you know, to speak to somebody who firsthand actually went to a protest, and as you're saying, you're just singing, you're just, you know, protesting in peace, and then they just go to bother you anyway, and then the way it's sort of reported in the media is spun, right? That's really eye-opening. That's something that's very critical and important to know, right? You would never know if you're somebody on the side and it's like, oh, okay, let's, you know, oh, these people are going to protest. Well, I would never protest. I don't want to cause trouble, or I don't want to do this, so I'm going to be one of those people who stays home. But then you actually don't know if you live the life of somebody who tried to protest. It's a radically different experience. That's
and you would never believe it either. So unless like, you know, there was somebody to share the story, you would never think that. You'd be like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. If you're just sitting and singing, why in the world would they attack you? They're reasonable people. It's sort of like that economic theory of, well, you know, the reason, going back to capitalism, the reason why capitalism works is because we're all rational actors and we all go off into the world and we want what's best for everybody, yada, 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 even though obviously that's not true. So, but the idea there is that like, why that doesn't make any sense. Like you have, let's say, you know, people who probably weigh maybe sometimes even over 100 pounds less, you know, than these people who are heavily armored. Why in the world would they need to attack them? They're not in any danger. That doesn't make any sense. But then, yeah, when you hear these firsthand accounts, and even obviously now with kind of the social media age and, you know, kind of modern technology, you see this all captured on video. People are like, holy shit, I can't believe that this is happening. Remember that video of that NYPD truck that ended up like driving into that group of protests? Yeah. And if you never saw that, nobody would have ever believed that something like that happened. They would have been like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would they do that? Well, they weren't in any danger. No one was trying to harm them. So it's like, unless somebody actually shows it for the other person to go, oh wow, man, some of these people really are irrational and do things that like really sort of, when we're talking about the level of danger in relation to the response, just doesn't make any sense, then it makes people go, oh wow, now I got it.
But I want to resist this idea that what police are doing when they beat up protesters is irrational. It's only irrational if you buy into the idea that the reason police are there is to, quote, protect and serve, right? If you believe that the function of police is the maintenance of like a just and liberated society, then it seems totally irrational for them to beat the crap out of us and to harass Black and brown people, you know, and to commit sexual assault and domestic violence at, you know, rates that are like, you know, 4, 5, 10 times the national average. But if you understand really that the role that police play in capitalist society is as the physical force of domination to keep people in their place, all of a sudden it becomes a lot less irrational for them to play that out. And so part of what I think political philosophy has really unlocked for me is the ability to see, actually, when police beat me in the face with a baton, when they shoot an unarmed Black teenager 17 times in the back, like they did to Laquan McDonald, when they harass Latinx people on the presumption that they are in the country illegally, when they stop and strip search Black women on the side of the highway, right? Like when they do all of these horribly brutal things, something changes when you see that part of their function, part of their role is to create fear, terror, and therefore compliance, right? And that's a really different way to understand what it is police are doing in our society than they're irrational people who are somehow like, engaging in individualistic, sadistic fantasies, which maybe they are also. But really the reason why this is so widespread, the reason this is a structural issue that can't be reformed by like implicit bias training or like jailing a few killer cops or whatever, is because the whole function that police have in our society, whether or not they're individually like nice people to their neighbors and their kids or whatever, is like their function as police, like qua police, is compliance and compulsion.
Mhm. That's nuts to think that even that's interesting that you mentioned implicit bias training, because you would think, I mean, ideally, you would think you tell people what sort of, you explain the dynamics of a situation, of a particular social interaction, especially when things get heated, or how to sort of interpret the other, right? And how you can have these misconceptions about how you interpret them and all that. You would think that that would be useful to train the police on, but what you're saying essentially is this is an institutionalized sort of system of control. Like it's bigger than these individualistic concerns that each particular police officer has.
Totally.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Totally. And so like implicit bias training can be helpful at transforming individuals, for sure. Like it can be useful. But ultimately, when your job, right? And like many police's job is to like go around and harass Black and brown youth. So however much implicit bias or sensitivity training you have, if your commander still sends you into a predominantly Black and brown neighborhood to harass and round up teenagers, like no amount of implicit bias training is going to change what you do in your day-to-day. And so I'm not against implicit bias training. I'm not against and like, stepping away from police. Like we all have implicit biases. Understanding them, reckoning with them, trying to overcome them, engaging them critically is a great thing to do. But I think my work is more interested in like, why do we have these implicit biases, right? Like what are the structures that cause bias? And what kinds of large social transformations would be necessary in order to uproot these underlying systems from our social reality? And for me, that has to do with like the abolition of capitalism, the abolition of cops, the overcoming of private property, and the installation of like a feminist racial justice sort of society, none of which we're in any way doing at the current moment.
No, of course. I mean, cops, for instance. I mean, right, like you said, even if somebody had implicit bias training, they're still just following orders, right? Or they have too much social pressure from their group or from their commanding officer, whatever.
Or there might be like a dual mind for like the way I'm thinking about it, because if we're saying that, okay, so let's say there's some exterior force that's saying, well, this department, or even let's say the series of departments, they have to go through these training courses. But then on the other hand, the foundation is, well, it's actually us against the world. People hate us. We're there to do our jobs. Nobody cares what happens to us, yada, yada. The idea is that we only have to look out for each other. But then some external source is saying, well, you actually need this training. They're like, yeah, sure, we'll do the training. That's fine. You give us whatever you want. We'll complete your courses. Now leave us alone. So the idea is it's like these two sort of dichotomous belief systems that are kind of crashing up against each other.
So okay, so all right. So we need to make bigger societal changes, structural changes, right? What would we potentially do instead of police?
Yeah.
Like, or how could that be done differently? I suppose, because I mean, there may be a need to. I mean, I would say if you have an emergency, you would
we still
like somebody
need
to
something, right, to protect people. Yeah.
to come help, I suppose. I just wonder what that would look like if it's not the police that we're used to.
Yeah.
I mean, so the idea of there being something like a social system of help sounds great to me. I just don't think that armed agents of the state are people who are A, intending to help us, or B, who are most effective at helping us. So like, for example, when someone's having a mental health crisis, if you call a cop, they're likely to incarcerate that person, like put them in a physical cage. They might use medical, like they might use medical restraints, like injections of some kind. They might use physical restraints like chokeholds or sitting on someone's neck. None of that seems to respond to the problem, which is there is a person who is experiencing a mental health crisis without adequate care and support. So my question is like, well, how do we make sure that people who are experiencing mental health crises have adequate care and support, right? And to me, that has nothing to do with cops. The same thing is true with, by and large, with theft, right? Like someone gets called because they've stolen whatever it is, and you're like, cool, why is it that in some places you have to rely on theft in order to feed your family? The problem to me is not solved by, then throw this parent in jail for shoplifting baby formula because that's going to keep all of us safe. You're like, no, why are there kids running around without fucking baby formula? That's the problem. That's the violence. And I think if we solve the violence, right, like that is already being done to us all, to our communities constantly on a day-to-day basis, I think you would find that a lot of these problems that seem to be solved by cops are already solved on their own. Like if we were actually worried about solving poverty and houselessness and domestic violence and like all kinds of other problems that we rely on, you know, like that we rely on guns to fix now, we could actually help and solve problems and not need cops. I've never seen a situation in which a cop has helped. I just don't believe it.
I mean, I'm sure there had to have been some.
I don't believe it.
Yeah. Well, and so what?
But even so, no, I get your point though. You're saying like, for example, instead of we know that there's going to be some domestic violence, so we need cops to solve that. You're saying let's attack the root of the cause of what's creating domestic, for example. Or
especially just like it's interesting that like a lot of people use the case of domestic violence when they're like, you know, trying to be like, no, we can't do abolition because domestic violence, right? And like on the one hand, do you know who is statistically the most likely group of people to abuse a partner? Cops.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like first off, I don't know why we're like relying on them to be the savior of people experiencing domestic violence when they're more likely than anyone to be the perpetrators of domestic violence in the first place. Second of all, when a person is experiencing domestic violence or intimate partner violence, like they don't need to be interrogated. They don't need to potentially be arrested on mandatory arrest laws. They don't need to have their children often taken away from them for the failure to stop the domestic violence. All of this is what happens when the carceral system gets involved in the prosecution or solving of domestic violence. That's often not what we need. Often what we need is something like food, safe housing, therapy, economic independence, like real help for problems that people are experiencing that then come out as domestic violence. We need to like undo toxic masculinity that often sort of suggests that the way to deal with problems is through physical violence. Like none of those things, right? None of the things that might actually help a person who's experiencing domestic violence or prevent domestic violence in the first place, to me, are solved by, you know, like armed people doing more violence on people by putting them in cages, perpetuated by people most likely to do domestic violence. Like none of that makes any sense to me. And it only makes sense, right? So like when you look at a system that makes so little rational sense like that, right? You have like domestic abusers themselves getting guns by the state to come into someone else's house to throw people in a cage that we know like itself perpetuates further violence. That system doesn't make sense if you think, right, that the goal of cops is to solve violence. That that narrative cannot be squared. So the only thing that could possibly make sense is like that is not actually their job. Their job is not to solve domestic violence. Their job is not to stop violence at all. Their job is to do something totally else. And that other thing, right, at creating compliance, fear, terror, at like being the armed agent of the state, they're doing a great job, right? They are fulfilling their job. It is just not the job that they tell people is their job. It's not the job that the media says is their job, right? But otherwise, the system makes no sense.
Yeah. And so what would you do, like, let's say in this transition period, right? Between, let's say let's say if we're talking about big societal structural changes and we're saying, okay, we need to sort of, again, develop kind of going back to the safety net, develop a stronger safety net for people, give them more opportunities, let's say for work, give them more opportunities for education, right? But then, I mean, obviously, as I'm sure everybody agrees that it's not going to happen overnight. And then, so what do we do in the meantime while there is still violence?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think we fund and support community responses to the problems that communities are facing. So like, just, I mean, this to leave aside the police problem for just a minute, but like it has taken, right, like a full 9 months for the US government to give us like, what is it, $600 that we're getting as like, COVID relief, like something ridiculous. How much could rent possibly cost for 8 months? $600? You guys live in New York, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, not
on the other hand, right, like complete incompetence, like total ridiculousness.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you look at the wide network of mutual aid support that has sprung up in this pandemic, neighbors feeding neighbors, neighbors clothing neighbors, neighbors running around doing grocery shopping for elderly and immunocompromised neighbors, people redistributing their own stimulus, their first stimulus payments that were only sort of real, right? Like toward incarcerated and undocumented people who would not be getting stimulus payments. Like all of that combined mutual aid network, which like had no direction, no funding, no institutional support, right, has been so much more effective at helping your average person than Congress. And so like, I think sometimes when we think about these large scale transformations, we go into the imaginative space. Like, how could we imagine, right? Like doing these other things. And I think there's something that's useful about that. And on the other hand, I want to say, like, can we look at the things people are already doing? People are making Herculean efforts to fill gaps that our society leaves open. And they're doing it in ways that are so much more effective than the capitalist institutions of power that we are told to rely on. And I think when we look at all of the neighborhood and community like protection zones, sort of like underground railroad of women who needed abortions before Roe, like there's so many projects in the history of the United States, the underground railroad itself, right, that we could point at and see human beings who have looked at needs that existed in their communities and their societies and have stepped in to fill them in ways that were 1,000% more effective than the structures of power. Because the structures of power are not there to solve our problems. They are there to further recreate them. So I understand the question, like, what do we do in the meantime? And I think what we do in the meantime is like what people are already doing. We highlight that, we expand, we replicate, we like give due credit to people who are already doing it. We like ask for help and mutual understanding of that, like how they have done that. How can I adapt that to my local context, which might be slightly different? Like, I think all of the tools and skills are there. And obviously we like, seize all the yachts and auction them off and pay for all the things we need.
That actually makes me think
of a huge part of it too. Like we seize the hotels and we turn them into housing for houseless people. Like we just take, at a certain point, right? People realize that they need to take the things they need.
Yeah, and that makes me think of, since obviously we're in New York, that makes me think of the Guardian Angels. Do you know anything about them?
The motorcycle guys?
They're not. No, you're thinking of the Hells Angels.
Hell's Angels.
Yeah, so I'm sure, Ashley, you probably know we have the Guardian Angels here. I don't know if they're still active or maybe they are. But yeah, so like when the mafia here was pretty active, like in the 70s and 80s, they realized that there was this kind of gaping hole in the NYPD, that they weren't really actually doing that much. So this group of guys, I forgot the founder's name. He was this really cool guy. So they decided, you know what, we're going to be kind of vigilantes and we're going to protect the streets ourselves. And they would really go up and down, right around trains. Yeah. And they would really just protect communities. And like, I forgot who damn, I wish I remembered this name. But yeah, he was like John Gotti made him like his number one enemy. Like they actually had a contract out on him because he hated him that much. And so, yeah, and they didn't hate the NYPD anywhere near as much as they hated the Guardian Angels. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, there's a good example of your point. Yeah.
Dean Spade has a good new book called Mutual Aid that is about a lot of these projects. Mutual Aid is great. Yeah.
Were you going to say something?
No, I mean, I would like to see what other people are doing that's working, and also be able to replicate and reproduce it
Right.
as well, right? I mean, that's incredibly important. I wouldn't even know. I mean, I'm sure I've browsed on the internet before, somewhere on my news feed, let's say Facebook or some social media. I've seen articles related to sort of community programs. But I'm really like, Ashley, do you know, maybe like, if you do, like, well, maybe somewhere you could point us to, maybe see examples of um, I suppose not community policing, but like sort of like the community helping each other, and maybe some programs that they're doing.
Yeah, there are a lot of really, really, really good resources on the abolition of police and abolition in general. Lots of really amazing books. I can super highlight Angela Davis's work on this question. I think also, um, like Dean Spade has really interesting work on mutual aid. And so I think, like, if you're interested in, like, I could give like a whole reading list about, like, like theories and histories of attempts at police abolition, at like alternatives to policing that have gone like better and worse. But honestly, like, the thing that I would say, rather than, I mean, do all the reading is great. 10 out of 10, love the reading.
Mhm.
Professional reader, I love it, right? But I think also, like, in a certain sense, like, the something that I learned a lot from doing activism is that, like, there's still a gap, right, between the most raddest, baddest social theory, like, like liberationist theory, and the feeling of being there in person and doing it and watching it unfold in practice, and like watching human beings take risks for each other and show up to defend each other, and like hold raise the rent parties, and like lock arms in front of a family who's about to get evicted. Like, all of those things are real experiences, and real people do them all the time. And so, like, really what I would say to people that are watching is, like, read the theory if you want, but really, like, find what is happening in your community and go there and support them. Show up to an eviction defense. Like, the eviction moratorium is going to expire on January 31st. And by some estimates, almost a third of people in the United States are facing housing insecurity at the expiration of that eviction moratorium. There are going to be eviction defenses. There are going to be community, organized efforts to keep people in safe housing. And you should go to them. And if there isn't one in your community, you should organize one, right? Like, this is what we need. Like, we need to protect ourselves and our communities from the state, from capital, from the banks and the landlords, right? And like, find what is happening in your community. Maybe it's a rent strike, maybe it's an eviction defense, maybe it's a food not bombs, maybe it's a COVID mutual aid society, maybe it's like an arts collective that is like raising money for school supplies in underfunded schools. Like, there are so many projects happening literally everywhere. And I honestly believe that if you, like, there is abolition work happening everywhere. There is activist work happening everywhere. And I think, rather than like hold fast to like one specific model of what it should look like, I always think that the strongest and best work that we can be doing is work that comes out of the immediate needs of our community. So I don't know exactly, like, I don't know where people are listening from, but that's what I would say.
No, I hear you. Yeah, instead of being a spectator, right? Being in reaction to everything that's going on in your community, thinking, okay, whoever's protesting, they're the protest people. Like, I'm the person, I don't get involved in that. It's a wrong way to think, right? The idea is, don't spectate. Take action. You see a problem that needs addressing in your community. Don't just sit there. Really try to go help. And in that helping, yeah, you can have as many ideas as you want, right? And like you said, the baddest radical theories, right? But at the same time, it's like the it's so cliche, but the proof is in the pudding, right? Like, you have to take action, and it's in action that you'll learn more about activism in action than you will from, well, I don't want to say more than from reading. I think both are important,
Yeah.
but
And one reinforces the other. I mean, you need the experience and the evidence, right, to support your ideas.
I just don't like to say black and white things, but in general, action is important, is what I'm getting.
And speaking of black and white thinking, because I know this is going to be black and white, but it's still prominent. So Ashley, how do you think that, where did the divide between academia and activism, where did it come from and how did it happen? Because it's so stark now, like pretty much you can kind of see it like with kind of the Steven Pinkers of the world and, you know, whomever else, right? They kind of like really disdain activists and like activists on the other end. I mean, I don't know what they necessarily think of academics, but it does seem like there's this big divide between the two.
I mean, yeah, I don't know like where this happened initially. I could only speculate about that. My guess is that like, if I had to hazard a guess, I would say that it's because, right, activists tend to come from the disenfranchised and disempowered, right? They're the ones with a lot to gain by changing up the system. And academics, right, because academia requires a lot of expensive schooling, right, tends to come from the class most interested in maintaining the current power structure, right? So there are exceptions, right, on both sides. There are working class academics. There are academics who go to protests and throw down. Like, it's not black and white. But like, I think in general, right, because of the way we do education in this country, which is like an abomination, right? Like academics tend to come from highly, highly, highly privileged backgrounds with like independent wealth, or at a minimum, right, like an upper middle class structure of family support to fall back on, or spouses who make more money than they do, or whatever, right? Like, it's not easy to do what I did, which is to be a self-sustained academic all through graduate school. Sucks. And so I think there's like often a gap in experience and a gap in like where people are coming from. I also think that academia is really self-referential. Like, academics often only talk about ideas to other academics. They often use language that is really hard to understand if you're not initiated, right, into the chosen few of the doctor club, right? And so I think there's a lot of also animosity, right, that academics have created by, I don't know, hoarding or hoarding resources, hoarding knowledge, hoarding research, putting all their research behind academic paywalls. Like, who's going to pay $40 to read your article? You know what?
Yeah, that I never understood. Yeah, crazy stuff. Yeah, you know, have you seen that? Like, academic articles are literally like $40 a pop.
You know, it'd be cool if they had that idea that if it just was really popular enough, you offered it for free, and then you could sell ads on it. But nobody. Or maybe somebody thought of it, they haven't executed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I'm assuming that's kind of your point in public philosophy, right? To sort of the idea of something that we talked about before, right? We talk about all the time, is sort of making it more mainstream, because these topics and like the conclusions of, you know, kind of philosophers have formed, and even from psychology too, obviously, like these are important for everybody to know.
Totally. And like, look, it's kind of easy to hate on academics and jargon and whatever. Like, sometimes speaking in jargon is helpful because it's technical shorthand, right? And sometimes when you're speaking to other specialists, technical shorthand allows you to say things a bit faster, right? And that can be helpful inside a certain context. The thing that I'm critical of, when that's the only context we train people to care about and the only vernacular they are able to use. So I'm not saying like no one should ever, like have specialized vocabulary, but I am saying like, how are you then taking the fruits of being able to speak quickly with other specialists and like transform that elsewhere? But also, right, it's like the other thing that drives me bananas is the idea that only people with PhDs have valuable knowledge, right? That like people with PhDs are the ones who make the knowledge. And I'm always like, God, academics know, especially when we talk about politics and organizing and radical social theory. I read all this stuff that comes from people with PhDs. And I'm like, you know nothing. So just some of the assumptions that academics make because of the like encasement in the ivory tower is laughable. And it's because they often only think about like regular people, right? And people without PhDs as their research subjects, right? Like as data to input into a spreadsheet. And I think that's also like a real lost opportunity for understanding, exploring like how people are understanding, thinking about, reflecting on, changing, and making meaning in the world. Like people are doing that every day, all the time. You don't need a fucking PhD to do that. Like everyone is doing that all the time. And people who don't have PhDs are like a huge wealth of knowledge and experience and advice, inspiration and dreams, and like all kinds of other things that I think like those of us who are paid to read books and write them are really missing out on deepening our research, like, and being better thinkers by being so enclosed in talking to other kind of knowledge technocrats, which is, I think, the kind of direction that academia has been on since the 80s, which sucks.
And it's such a shame that it's so threatening for a lot of them. It's like if we put our knowledge, or if we make our knowledge more accessible and more people know about it, then what's the point of us even being here? What sort of role do we have?
Well, the thing is, they give each other status, right? So once you have this particular degree, you have gone to this particular school, you have written this many books, or you've written a book about this particular subject, and then you become recognized by your peers and you get a sense of status. I suppose, I suppose many academics might, I don't want to paint, broad strokes here, but yeah, I'm sure that, they would think of regular folk as like not being able to contribute as much value as they can. I mean, granted, from reading a lot, from doing a lot of research, you are definitely gearing your brain towards, memorizing a whole bunch of information. Things will come to you quickly, like almost intuitively, because you've studied it so much. So you do get something from all those hours of study.
Right.
But only a certain kind of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
It's like I think academics love to overemphasize like how much they gain from how much they've studied, which is true. Like we gain a lot of facility with like language and ideas and techniques, right, of doing them over and over again. But also like they like to underemphasize what kinds of doors are being closed, right, by doing this, like leaning into the same way of producing knowledge over and over again. So yes, we're gaining a lot of expertise in something incredibly, incredibly narrow. And they don't, and like academics in general don't like to say like, oh yes, like in this super, super narrow thing, that has often meant that we have been closing, right, avenues toward exploring the same question in a variety of other ways, right? Or that could be enriched or complemented or expanded or changed, right? Or could reveal the limits of this super narrow thing that I'm doing if I were talking to other people. And not just other academics. I don't mean that like philosophers could benefit from talking to neuroscientists and sociologists, though that is also true. But I think there's something overall about academic specializations and the presumption about what constitutes knowledge and how knowledge sounds and what it looks like and the form in which it is produced and distributed, right? That is already closing off so much,
Yeah, so what's fantastic is it's that idea of gatekeeping, right? It's like you said, like the gates are closed to the outside. What's fascinating is with the advent of things like, let's say, podcasts, right? Now you don't necessarily have to be in a particular space to have essential knowledge sort of disseminated to you. You can hear somebody. Also, what's fantastic is when you hear somebody having conversation, it's not like a written script. Like, for example, like you were saying at that seminar or wherever you went, they're reading from their paper, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that.
Oh, God,
there's
so
a time
boring.
and place for that. Fair enough. Right?
It's so boring.
And it sounds terrible. It sounds boring.
And I do it too, right? I'm not like exempting myself. Like I have done this too. It's so boring.
Right. But what's fantastic is when it's conversational, or someone brings their own personality to the way they sort of get that information out there, it's translated differently. Like, it's weird. It's like as a kid, whenever I learned anything in school, I kind of associated learning with just sort of this like boring monotone like explanation to like 30 people in the class or whatever it is. But when you actually listen to somebody who's engaged and passionate, it doesn't necessarily even have to be passionate, but some sort of emotional intonation, whatever is them, right, comes out in whatever it is that they're expressing, it sounds a million times more interesting, and also something that you could sort of relate to as just a regular person.
Right.
And that's I think one way how we sort of disrupted these gatekeepers and academics.
Right.
In fact, I think they've gotten creative as well. I was about to say they need to be creative in terms of getting it out, but they are being, by going on all these shows as well, and all of that.
And also, I think it's also worth mentioning. So just even a message for the gatekeepers. So this is something that's kind of even still a little bit hard to talk about, but I think it's worth mentioning. So my college mentor recently passed away. And so like he was quite possibly the best human being I've ever known. And he figured it out. So everybody that I speak to about him, when they ask like, oh, like what was he like? Or kind of how did he live? I said, if I could pick one person who I would say was sort of the epitome of the good life, it was him. Like he figured it out. So his name was Dr. Tim Stroop, and he taught at John Jay College. So for Tim, right, he could have honestly done anything that he wanted, like pretty much anything. So he went to Harvard Law School. He graduated from Oxford with a PhD in philosophy. He literally just whatever he wanted to, he could have chosen. He was literally a genius. Like this was like legit, objectively a genius. And so for Tim, which was so interesting, he actually never took any of that stuff like really seriously. And so most of his life, first of all, he knew from like an early age that he wanted to teach at a CUNY system, which was really interesting because, the CUNY system is mostly full of like just, poor working class and middle class kids. These are kids that wouldn't go normally to Harvard. Some of them do, by the way, so it's not black and white, but a lot of them they don't come from wealth, obviously, not even close to it. And so for Tim, it was really important to sort of give back to that community, because for him, he always felt like, even though he didn't necessarily, because he did come from an academic background and, his parents were kind of like teachers and his dad was a dean, but he felt more connected to their community. And so for him, he realized that the credentials were nowhere near as important as the relationships that he built. So it's so interesting because if you go to John Jay College, there's like this wall. And so on this wall, it's like full of these like tiny plaques, and on the plaques we would have like people's like teachers' names, and it would say like such and such earned his doctorate at whatever year, right? So it would say doctor yada yada, right? Graduated from whatever. So it's like these different professors. But then Tim actually has one too, and so what's so striking about it is how dissimilar it is to the others. So number one, Tim does not have his credentials on it, and it says, for all of my students, past, present, and future, this is for you, and it's assigned Timothy Stroop. It does not say doctor on it or professor or anything along those lines. So when I would talk to Tim, I would always ask him, I would say, like, how come you don't want to write more? Like, he was a phenomenal writer. The pieces that he wrote were just sensational. And he's like, well, it's not that important to me. What's important to me is like talking to you folks and having friendships with you and sort of like, kind of being able to like teach you and whatever. And I remember at the time when I initially met him, this is just how great of a human he was. So it's not something I'm proud of, but I was. So I was once a libertarian, and I was not only a libertarian, I was also a conspiracy theorist. So when I took the whole shebang. So when I took Tim's class, so he taught an ethics and law class in John Jay. So when I took Tim's class, I was incredibly combative and like aggressive, not horribly so, but I was like, oh, I'm going to show this guy up. And so I was sitting in the front of the class, and we would constantly like kind of go back and forth, and he would make jokes. He would say, oh, well, he's wrong about everything. And I would say, no, he's actually the one who's wrong about everything. And so what was great about Tim was that he, little by little, he would give me these different like books to read. And he'd say, look, I'm going to get you this book. You don't have to read it. He's like, just if you don't want to read it, you don't have to read it. But he's like, if you're not going to read it, just like let me know and give it back to me. I'll give it to someone else. And I'd be like, no, you know what? I'll give it a chance. I'll read your stuff. And little by little, and we had pretty much a friendship that spanned a decade. He's like, I just want you to see what it's like on the other side. He's like, you don't have to accept any of this stuff, right? But this human cared so much about my development that for him, it wasn't important whether or not I subscribed to his ideas and his sort of ideology and his theories. And by the way, he was a socialist. He was pretty open about it. And so it wasn't important to him that I subscribed to whatever he believed in. What was important for him was that I had a more nuanced understanding of just like the world around me. And I knew what it was that I was actually arguing against. So of course, as I read the literature little by little, I actually then turned to his perspective. And he was like, wow, holy shit, like it actually, like it worked, right? But the reason why it worked was because he cared so deeply about relationships, that he wasn't the gatekeeper in the sense that we're talking about it, right? He wasn't an academic in the sense of like, here's all of this stuff that I know, and I'm a doctor and I know more than you. And so it's sort of, you need to treat me as though like, I'm somehow your superior. It wasn't important to him. What was important to Tim was that people took the knowledge and they pretty much thought for themselves. I mean, and the ethics and law class was more about critical thinking than it was about even the information that he was giving. He just wanted people to be able to think for themselves and form their own conclusions. If it happened to have been that you pretty much ended up subscribing to his belief system, great. I mean, he was happy about it. He's like, fantastic. He's like, now you understand why I see things the way I do. But for him, in the way that he kind of lived his last years was sort of the epitome of what a good, and even just the way he lived his life overall was the epitome of a good life, because he learned that people were more important than credentials, and that for him, he never had the need to be superior. So it just wasn't a part of who he was. And again, going back to the gatekeepers, if I wish I could have like a sort of a video or a movie of him so I could show it to them and say, no, look, this is what it means to live a good life. You don't need to be smarter or better or whatever it is than anybody else. This man lived and died a happy individual, and that's why. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's it. That's all I got. So yeah, and it's cool because Ashley, it seems like you figured that out too. You kind of figured out that in terms of philosophy, what's most important is really sort of the work you do with people.
I try, and like all people, I sometimes do it better and sometimes fail to instantiate the highest version of my values. But like that's part of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of the growing process or whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's never, that's something like that doesn't really ever end.
Yeah,
no, but it's perfect because then, well, either way, I mean, we're not static, right? We learn, for example, if at one point a message doesn't get across, okay, then you sort of see, into the goings on, see, okay, why didn't it come across? Okay, I'll do this, and this next time or whatever.
Right.
It's fine, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I learn a lot about that from my students, like, like, oh, this didn't land. Why didn't this land? Like, oh, okay. Like how, like the thing that I love about teaching is the constant learning process. And like, I think the idea that professors are in the classroom and they're just like teaching and the students are the one that's doing the learning is like completely backwards. Like anyone who's like really engaged with the relational process of thinking about ideas in the classroom, which is what I'm always trying to do, is like, I'm learning as much, if not more, than my students are learning all the time. I'm learning from them. I'm learning from our interaction. I'm learning from watching their interactions. And it's like a really beautiful, like transformative process, I hope, for all of us, right? That they're learning things, I'm learning things. We're like learning, like, things like data, like we're learning things from text, but we're also like learning how to talk about ideas in a different way, I'm learning constantly how to be more accessible and rely less on jargon or to explain things in a different way. They're learning how to sometimes, like, they're sometimes learning that jargon. They're sometimes learning how to deconstruct that jargon. They're sometimes learning how to apply philosophical ideas to music videos, right? Like, we're coming from different places, but I hope that like what the classroom part of being an academic is about like growing and stretching and changing through a process of dialogue, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's such a great point to sort of end off point. Perfect. So Alan, final questions before we go, buddy?
Yeah. If we wanted to follow your work and read your new book, how could we find you?
Well, you can read my new book. In the US, you can get it at Columbia University Press. In the UK, you can get it at Pluto. And in continental Europe, you can get it at Transcript Verlag. I don't know, a lot of my articles are up on my academia.edu page, which is sort of the best place to follow my work. I have a website, that's ashleyjbohrer.com. You can follow my stuff there. I'm very bad at social media and posting on social media, so I wouldn't try to follow me there.
That's the best, most honest answer I've ever heard.
Well, I mean, but definitely, let's say just for social media, we could find you at the APA blog on like all of the social media platforms, right? Yeah.
You could totally read lots of things that I edit at the APA Public Philosophy blog. I don't write myself on it very much, but I definitely edit lots of really cool attempts that my colleagues around the country and around the world are trying to do with public philosophy. 10 out of 10 recommend reading it. It's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. This was so insightful.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Ashley. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Wow.
All right. What a ride.
All right. So, guys, if you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe, hit the bell
on YouTube. And then you can also find us at the O4L Online Network at O4LOnlineNetwork.com. And we're up top under the STM podcast section.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.